There's been immense damage from the flooding in KwaZulu-Natal, as you've seen on your screen today. It really is immense. In some places, more water has landed, it seems, in the last 24 hours than you'd see in a 5-month period. I understand 300 mils of rain fell in other places. It's just the most incredible amount of water. At the same time, if you live in the interior of the country, in Gauteng or the Free State, there's been a huge amount of rain this rainy season, perhaps more rain than we've seen in one season in around just the last 20 years or so. Dr. Tafadzwanashe Mabhaudhi is a climate expert at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I should in fact say Professor Mabhaudhi. Professor Mabhaudhi, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. When we see floods like this in KwaZulu-Natal, in Durban primarily today, just such a large amount of water, can we say that this is linked to climate change? Is this partially the result of climate change?
Afternoon and thanks. Well, it is certainly consistent with the projections on climate change, which tell us that we are going to be experiencing more such weather in terms of weather extremes such as flash floods and droughts. So it is consistent with that narrative.
I mean, what about climate change? What about a sort of hotter planet leads to this? I would imagine the idea of more energy in the atmosphere. Energy comes from heat, if I've understood it correctly. That just leads to bigger storms.
So it's the whole concept of global warming and climate change basically has very variable effects in terms of the weather patterns and the weather system as we know it. So whilst temperatures are going up, and it's mostly been talking about global warming, but it has an effect and an impact in terms of the weather system as we understand it. And so that is what is driving now some of these extremes in weather, where either in places where there's more warming, like where we are getting either extremes in terms of dryness or some extremes in terms of wetness, such as the current flash flooding that we have experienced. So that whole changing, climate is long-term, but in the interim, what we then experience as part of that climate change is the increasing variability of weather as well as the increasing extremes in weather patterns.
Would another way of looking at maybe that there has been what's called the Nina and El Nino weather effects for many, many years. It's related to the temperature of water at the top of the Pacific Ocean. When you get a La Nina effect, as we had last year, that tends to lead to more rain in Southern Africa. That's what happened. That will happen naturally. Climate change means that a La Nina effect will have a much bigger effect than it would have otherwise, which leads to this flooding. Would that capture it properly?
Yeah, that would capture it properly.
So then, I mean...
So we've always had, so when I was talking about the weather systems, we've always had the La Nina and the El Nino. But the severity now of those weather systems is what is being affected and what we are experiencing.
So then, if the Earth continues to warm up, and I mean there's been some really scary predictions coming out of the temperatures at the North Pole this year, and I think at the South Pole, what we're likely to see then is more floods like this in the future.
So if we've got the 3 RCPs, 2.6, 4.5, and 8.5, 8.5 being worst case scenario. Already scientists have suggested that 2.6 scenario is no longer feasible. If we work hard, we'll maybe achieve the 4.5 scenario. But currently on the trajectory that we are, we might miss the 4.5 scenario as well, meaning that we should sort of brace for the worst. And that essentially means more of these flash flooding events as well as more droughts in areas in Southern Africa and South Africa.
So while we've had a huge amount of water, I think areas like Somalia have had their worst drought, I think, since 1984. Next year, it could be the other way around.
Yeah, so even here in South Africa, there are parts of South Africa, such as the Eastern Cape, Northwest, and parts of Northern KwaZulu-Natal that had not really exited drought. They were still technically going through drought. So we can still experience these flash flooding events even during a drought season per se. So the challenge is whilst you might be experiencing dryness or drought, then when the rainfall comes, it might come in a flash flood, such as what has happened, which, is not beneficial to agriculture. It's not beneficial really to storage. It damages infrastructure. So, neither scenario would be helpful to people on the ground.
So what do we need to do then? I mean, Japan, for example, is a country which has been for the last 200 years preparing for earthquakes. Do we need to do the same with climate change in South Africa? We need to prepare for it. We need to build our buildings in a particular way. We need to encourage people who are settled in areas like in Alexandra, for example, next to a river, to actually move. We need to do that kind of thing.
So I'll say this first. Climate change is complex in that it is cross-cutting and touches on many aspects, not all aspects of life. So that makes it very complex to deal with because it cannot be approached from one direction. So it needs a multi-dimensional or multi-sectoral approach. That said, the example you gave of Japan is very good and very appropriate because what we often see is a lack of preparedness and more of response. So we've actually written a paper on it where we're talking to say that what we need is to improve the levels of preparedness rather than to focus on response where, something bad has to happen first and then we come in to sort of provide relief. And that has been the case mostly where, something happens and then we bring in the relief measures. But the focus, I think, now and going forward, where the rallying call should be, is around building preparedness, building early response capabilities through promoting integrated early warning systems, ensuring that the preparedness and the early warnings are cascaded down to the community level, so community-based warnings, because when these things happen, the impact is at a local level. It's people waking up, to find their beds floating, people waking up to find their houses washed away. So you need to build the capacity at that level. We need to work with people within communities to build their response capabilities, train them and equip them with skills on how to build structurally sound houses in rural areas and informal areas where they've settled. We have to think innovatively around, the engineering, both in the built and ecological infrastructure, to come up with integrated solutions that are able to manage these extremes. Say, when we have so much water like this exceeding 200 millimeters in 24 hours, how should we harvest that water? How should we channel it? Because like you said, the next thing is we're going to be having a drought. So how do we make sure that in these periods where we have these flash floods, we're able to harvest and store the water, we're able to prevent damage to infrastructure, we're able to start designing and constructing infrastructure that is climate resilient. They've done a lot of that in Japan to be able to start building buildings that don't easily go down when there's an earthquake. So those are the things that we should be working towards. We have a lot of good scientists in South Africa, with a lot of good science, and I think the experience from COVID, where we had science working with government, demonstrated very well what can happen when we have our scientists and researchers working with government to really bring about tangible solutions. So we need a similar thing here. The crisis of climate change is at a similar proportion, if not greater than the proportion of COVID, I would say.
Professor, I really appreciate the time. Professor Tafadzwanashe Mabhaudhi, an expert in climate change at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's